I've never really been the kind of person who enjoys parties. Even back in college, it didn't take long before I got tired of the whole routine: crowded bars, loud music, people drinking just to pass the time. After a while, it all started to feel empty. I realized I enjoyed something much simpler, a lot more. Spending time with a few close friends and doing something that actually meant something. Maybe that comes from where I grew up. I'm from a small rural area in northwestern Ontario. A place where winters are long, the forests feel endless, and silence can stretch for miles in every direction. When the snow falls out there, the world becomes incredibly quiet. Sometimes so quiet that even the smallest sound carries farther than it should. This happened a couple of years ago, and to this day, it's still the strangest New Year's Eve I've ever experienced. Ever since I was a kid, my dad had a tradition that most people would probably find unusual. While everyone else celebrated the new year with parties and countdowns, he and his friends would head out onto a frozen lake to go ice fishing. No fireworks, no crowds, just a dark winter sky, thick ice under our boots, and the faint glow of lanterns reflecting across the snow. My mom wasn't really around when I was growing up, and we didn't have much extended family nearby. So, for me, New Year's Eve usually meant standing out on that frozen lake in the bitter cold with my dad, my uncle, my brother, and a couple of my dad's old friends. It might sound strange to some people, but those nights became some of the most vivid memories of my childhood. Things changed over time, though. My dad passed away. My brother moved to Chicago years ago. Life slowly pulled everyone in different directions. But for some reason, I never stopped going out onto the ice. I can't fully explain why. Maybe it's loyalty, maybe it's nostalgia, or maybe part of me just feels like if I stop, then that piece of my dad's life disappears with it. So every New Year's Eve, I try to keep the tradition alive. Luckily, I'm not the only one. My two best friends, Nate and Trevor, are the kind of guys who seem more comfortable in the wilderness than anywhere else. Big, rugged guys, built like lumberjacks. The kind of people who don't mind hauling gear through deep snow or sitting for hours in the freezing wind without complaining. Honestly, I'd probably describe myself the same way. The three of us had kept the tradition going for a few years now, and in a strange way, it felt right, because spending New Year's Eve completely alone would have been a lot worse. So that year, just like always, we packed our gear and headed out for another quiet night on the ice. At least, that's what we thought it would be. What we didn't know yet was that someone else was already why. Nate was driving that night, and if there was ever a vehicle built for a trip like this, it was his truck. Huge tires, solid four-wheel drive, and just enough room in the back to haul everything we needed. Rods, tip-ups, bait, a heavy sled piled with gear, and a small pop-up shelter that could block the worst of the winter wind. We had done this enough times to know that the cold out there wasn't something you underestimated. The forecast promised clear skies, but in northern Ontario, weather reports are more like suggestions than guarantees. Still, we believed we were ready for whatever. The lake we were heading to wasn't the kind of place you'd find on a tourist map. That was exactly why we liked it. It sat hidden deep in the woods, surrounded by thick walls of pine and shadow. Even during milder winters, the surface froze thick and solid, like a sheet of dull gray glass stretching between the trees. If you didn't already know where it was, you could drive those back roads 100 times and never notice the narrow trail that led down to it. As Nate guided the truck along the snow-covered road, the excitement slowly started to build. Ice fishing has a strange kind of quiet to it. No music, no crowds, no bright lights, just you, the cold air, and the faint crunch of boots on frozen ground. Honestly, I'd take that over another noisy bar any day. The deeper we drove into the woods, the darker it became. The headlights carved two narrow tunnels through the falling snow, and the forest beyond them looked endless and still. Then, we finally reached the small clearing near the trailhead. Nate eased the truck to a stop, and that's when I noticed something. Someone standing a short distance away in the snow. At first, I thought it was just another fisherman, but the longer I looked, the stranger it felt. Because he wasn't moving, he was just standing there, watching us. The man stood a few yards away from the truck, bundled in thick winter gear, his face mostly hidden beneath layers of scarf and hood. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about him. After all, this was Northern Ontario in the middle of winter. Anyone spending time outdoors would be dressed exactly like that. But something about him didn't sit right with me. He wasn't moving, not adjusting his gear, not walking toward the lake, not even shifting his weight in the snow. He was just standing there, staring directly at our truck. At first, I figured he might be another angler who had gotten there before us. Maybe he was checking to see who else had shown up. That wasn't uncommon in places like this. Out here, you rarely run into strangers, and when you do, people tend to size each other up. But then I noticed something strange. The man looked down at his phone, then back at us, then down at the phone again, and then back at the truck. It happened more than once. Slow, deliberate movements, like he was comparing something on that screen with what he was seeing in front of him. I couldn't hear anything over the low rumble of the truck engine, but the whole thing gave me a feeling I couldn't quite explain. It didn't feel casual. It felt wrong. A cold uneasiness settled in the back of my mind, the kind of instinct that whispers something isn't quite right even when you can't prove it. I leaned slightly toward the middle seat and muttered to Nate and Trevor that the guy outside was giving me a weird vibe. Trevor glanced through the windshield and shrugged like it was nothing. Nate looked a little longer, his eyes narrowing for a second before he gave a small nod. But neither of them seemed too concerned. For a moment, the three of us just sat there, the truck idling softly, the forest around us completely still. Then Nate reached for the door handle, and we started getting ready to unload our gear. And that's when the man suddenly started running toward us. His arms were waving wildly in the air as he rushed across the snow, moving much faster than I expected. The look on his face, what little I could see of it, was pure panic. The man reached the truck in seconds, breathing hard, snow crunching beneath his boots as he waved both arms frantically. Instinctively, I rolled down the window, the freezing air rushing inside the cab. Before I could even ask what was wrong, he started, shouting over the sound of the engine. His voice was panicked, almost breaking as he told us that his friend had fallen through the ice out on the lake. According to him, the guy they were with had just called and said the ice had given way. Someone was in the freezing water right now. They needed help immediately. He kept pointing at the phone clutched in his hand, as if the device itself proved the urgency of the situation. His breathing was uneven, his words tumbling out over each other. And to be honest, it sounded convincing, desperate even. In a place like this, if someone actually broke through the ice, they wouldn't have much time. Everyone up north knows that. Trevor didn't hesitate. Before any of us could really think it through, he pushed open the truck door and jumped out into the snow. Nate and I followed almost automatically. In that moment, instinct took over. When someone says a person is trapped in freezing water, you don't stop to question every detail, you move. The man spun around and immediately started running down the narrow trail that led toward the lake. We ran after him. None of us even grabbed our coats or gear. The urgency in his voice had drowned out every other thought. The only thing that mattered was getting there as fast as possible. The man was practically sprinting, his boots kicking up loose powder as he rushed through the dark path between the trees. We had to jog just to keep up with him. Our breath came out in thick white clouds as the cold air burned in our lungs. Ahead of us, the trail opened toward the lake, and as we got closer to the shoreline, something slowly began to bother me. It was a small feeling at first, just a quiet thought creeping into the back of my mind, because the direction he was taking us didn't seem right. The farther we followed him along the shoreline, the more something inside me started to feel wrong. At first, it was just a quiet doubt, easy to ignore in the rush of the moment. But the longer we moved across the snow, the clearer it became. He wasn't leading us toward any of the usual fishing spots. Anyone who had spent time on that lake knew where the ice stayed thick and safe, and it definitely wasn't this direction. Instead, he was guiding us toward a darker, more remote stretch of shoreline, where the trees grew thicker and the ice was rarely used during winter. I slowed my pace slightly, my boots crunching in the frozen snow as a warning bell began ringing in my head. I was just about to call out to Nate and Trevor, maybe suggest we stop and think about this for a second. But it was already too late. Two shapes suddenly appeared ahead of us, near the edge of the lake. At first, they looked like shadows standing against the pale snow. Then the moonlight caught them, and I realized they were two men. They weren't moving, they weren't calling for help, and they definitely weren't dressed like fishermen waiting beside their holes in the ice. They were just standing there, waiting. Something inside my chest tightened instantly. My eyes dropped to their hands. And that's when my blood ran cold. Both of them were holding guns. One of the men stepped forward and shouted for us to stop right where we were. His voice echoed across the frozen shoreline. Before I could even process what was happening, the barrel of his gun lifted and pointed straight at me. It's hard to explain the feeling of that moment. Everything inside you just drops. Your mind goes blank while your heart suddenly feels like it's trying to hammer its way out of your chest. Then the man we had been following slowly turned around, and for the first time, I could see his face clearly. The panic was gone. In its place was a small, satisfied smirk. That's when it hit me. We had just walked straight into a trap. One of the armed men demanded Nate's truck keys and everything we had in our pockets, wallets, phones, anything of value. The way he spoke made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. Nate slowly reached into his pocket and tossed the keys toward them while the rest of us emptied our pockets into the snow. I tried to keep my phone hidden for a second, but one of them immediately noticed. Phones too. His voice was calm, but the message was clear. Nate quickly told them his phone was still inside the truck. They laughed at that, clearly amused. At the time, I thought it was just panic talking, but later I realized Nate had said that on purpose. Still, standing there with the cold wind cutting through our clothes, anger burned in my chest. I clenched my fists without even realizing it. If those guys hadn't been armed, I swear the three of us would have fought back right then. But none of us was stupid enough to try that. Within minutes, they had everything. One of the men backed Nate's truck down the trail and drove off into the darkness, the headlights disappearing between the trees. The other two slowly retreated into the forest, stepping back into the shadows like they had been part of the woods the whole time. And just like that, they were gone. For a moment, the three of us just stood there in silence, the cold suddenly feeling much sharper than before. Then Nate reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He hadn't left it in the truck after all. If he hadn't thought fast enough to lie back there, I honestly don't know what we would have done. Somehow, by pure luck, there was still a faint signal out there in the middle of nowhere. Nate dialed the police and began but as I stood there on that frozen shoreline, staring into the dark forest where those men had vanished, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just been part of something far more deliberate than a random robbery. The dispatcher told us to stay exactly where we were and wait for officers to arrive. Out there, in the freezing darkness, that sounded easier than it actually was. The cold had already started creeping through our clothes, and without the truck or our gear, the night suddenly felt much longer than it should have. The three of us stood close together near the trail, trying to block the wind as best we could while Nate held the phone to his ear. Anger hung heavy in the air. I was furious, but Nate was on another level. He paced back and forth through the snow, kicking the trunks of nearby trees and shouting curses into the empty woods. His breath came out in thick clouds while the forest swallowed every sound he made. Trevor tried a couple of times to calm him down, but it didn't do much good. None of us could really believe what had just happened. It had unfolded so quickly that my brain was still struggling to catch up. Just 30 minutes earlier, we had been laughing in the truck, talking about fishing and the new year. Now, we were standing in the middle of a frozen forest, robbed by strangers who had disappeared into the darkness like they had never been there at all. And the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why would anyone be waiting out there, in a place like that, on New Year's Eve of all nights? That lake wasn't popular. Most people didn't even know it existed. It wasn't somewhere you could just stumble upon by accident. Eventually, the flashing lights of a patrol vehicle appeared through the trees, cutting across the snow like a strange kind of relief. The officers took our statements, asked questions, and walked the area with their flashlights. But there wasn't much they could do. Whoever those men were, they had vanished long before help arrived. They gave us a ride back to Trevor's place. which was the closest house. As you might expect, Nate's truck was never found, and those men were never identified. Even now, years later, the three of us still talk about that night sometimes. Trevor believes we simply crossed paths with the wrong people at the worst possible moment. Maybe they hadn't even planned the robbery. Maybe we were just unlucky enough to show up when they needed a target. But the more I think about it, the harder that explanation is to accept. Because traps like that usually require planning. And the thing that still bothers me the most is this. If they were waiting there ahead of time, in a place that remote, how could they possibly know someone would arrive?